welcome to the One Society Network seminar series. I want to thank everyone for being here for our first event. My name is Ellen Rafferty, and I am a health economist at the Institute of Health Economics and the project manager of the One Society Network. And just a brief background on the goals of the One Society Network. So we were one of a few networks funded by the Public Health Agency of Canada and NSERC under their Emerging Infectious Diseases Modeling Initiative. And the network consists of researchers from across Canada working to understand the broad multi-sectoral impacts of infectious diseases like COVID-19 and other related public health policies. So really the goal of this introductory seminar is to give an overview of some of those dynamic connections between pandemics and diverse aspects of society. So we'll go through a lot of different sectors. So you saw, if you looked at the registration page, kind of every week is a different theme on a different sector. So today we have a focus on macroeconomics, but next week it's on the environment. So we hope you stay tuned for those. So I'll just hand it over to Dr. Chris McCabe, who is one of the co-leads of the network, to give a brief welcome.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everybody. It's great to see such a great turnout to our first seminar. As Alan said, I'm Chris McCabe. I'm on faculty at the University of Alberta and also Chief Executive of the Institute of Health Economics. And I co-lead the One Society Network with my colleague, Dr. Chris Cotton. The idea behind the network grew out of a task force run by the Royal Society of Canada on economic recovery post the post-COVID pandemic. We thought we were writing about things that would be happening in 2021, but we are where we are, and a lot of the ideas that Chris advocated for strongly in that task group have formed the foundation of the One Society Network. So welcome, and I'll hand over to Chris Cotton.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Ellen. Yeah, so we're very excited about kicking off this seminar series and getting more people aware of what we're doing through the One Society Network, and potentially engaging with us more over the coming year and a half or more as we build this out. Through the NSERC funding, the NSERC grant funding, and by setting up this network that grew out of, as Chris said, the Royal Society task force, we're really trying to build connections between economists, researchers in public health, epidemiologists, and others, all working towards the same goals around infectious diseases and COVID, and understanding the impacts that such events have for all of us. And I think that there's a lot of lessons for us to learn from one another. And the role of the One Society Network is to say that we shouldn't just be doing our research in our silos, but we should be working together, and we should be setting up the knowledge needed and the institutions needed to help us collaborate with one another. And so we're happy for people that want to get more involved, want to engage in more conversations going forward with members of our network, or to become collaborators with the network, or if you're working on these topics to start with, if you want to get involved in terms of maybe presenting research as we open it up for these things down the road, there'll be opportunities for this. And so by joining us today, I think there's a lot of we'll keep in touch as we're building up this capacity, and keep you informed about what we're doing. So thank you.
Thank you, Matt, so much, Chris and Chris. So just a few quick housekeeping items. So throughout the presentation, participants will be muted just because we are taping this so that people can have access to it later. So please submit your questions through the Q&A function. If you have general comments, we're happy to receive those in the chat. And we'll leave all questions till the end of the presentation, but feel free to kind of submit as we go, as they come to mind. So today, our seminar is titled On Modeling the Economic Impacts of Policy Responses to Pandemics. And it would be great if you could welcome us and join in welcoming our presenters, Dr. Hugh Lloyd-Ellis and Dr. Frédéric Tremblay. Hugh is a professor in the Department of Economics at Queen's University. He conducts academic research in a broad range of areas, including economic development, growth and inequality, economic fluctuations, fiscal policy, and housing. And his research is regularly published in leading journals. He's also an economic advisor for Limestone Analytics, where he has recently worked on projects related to trade and food security in East Africa, employment impacts of development interventions for the World Bank, and the economic impacts of COVID-19 in Ontario. And Frédéric is a NSERC and One Society Network postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Economics at Queen's University. He recently completed his PhD in economics at Queen's, where he researched savings groups as a financial inclusion intervention in international development. And in the last year, a lot of what he will be presenting today, he also worked on modeling the economic impact of COVID-19 and the associated lockdown policies, an analysis which really shaped provincial and federal policy. So with that, I'll hand it over to Hugh and Frédéric to get started.
Hello, everybody. Thanks very much for that introduction, Ellen, and thanks a lot to Chris and Chris for inviting us to discuss some of this stuff. So, without further ado, I'm going to get into this. So, the research behind this is work that is done with a bunch of people, actually. So, Chris Cotton and Brett Crowley, Barman Kashi are all involved at Limestone Analytics and at Queen's University, and Frédéric and myself. And so we had an article published in the CGE recently on this stuff. And then there's been a bunch of policy-oriented stuff, which is what most of this is about, coming out of some policy briefs with Limestone Analytics, this Global Canada's COVID Strategic Choices Group we've done some work for, and the NSERC Emerging Infectious Diseases Modeling Initiative, which is what we're working with right now. So I'm just going to start off by motivating what we're doing. And, you know, for some of you, this is kind of an obvious question, but I think right from the beginning of this pandemic, and even today, the question of why we need to know the economic costs of COVID-19 and the various waves is still prominent. So, you know, we can think of the key trade-offs. All of this must be well known by now. The benefits of restrictions, in particular, on economic activity in general, are intended to reduce the prevalence of illness, reduce mortality. And of course, the big factor which is kind of related to all of that is preventing the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. But of course, as we were well aware, there's lots of cost to these restrictions. The reductions in employment and consumption and income, increasing inequality, which is something which we're becoming aware of more and more. There's a disproportionate impact of these various shocks, various restrictions on women, minorities, lower income people, and younger workers. And there's interruptions to education and learning, which have much sort of short-term and longer-term effects, and the sort of health impacts of implied by all of that, in particular mental health impacts going forward. So of course, there's lots of issues here. The focus of what we're working on here really is just the cost of the restrictions vis-a-vis employment, income, and consumption. But these trade-offs, of course, play a big role, and there are lots of aspects to this that are important. And we wanted to make a contribution here in terms of making some estimates of some of these costs in the last few years. So the way we kind of think about this, we can think about this in several different ways. We can think about it from a short-term perspective, a medium-term perspective, and a long-term perspective. And so the short-term perspectives, I think, is what people tend to talk about a lot in the media in particular. At the moment, we're talking about this. It's just the trade-off between lives and livelihoods. And when we first started working on this, a lot of pushback that we got had to do with that, this is about saving lives. We shouldn't be so concerned with the economic costs. But of course, we always are. It's kind of in practice, we always make this trade-off implicitly or explicitly. When we think about, for example, the annual, before the COVID pandemic, we had the annual flu every year. People died regularly from the annual flu. We made decisions about whether or not to have restrictions based on that to try to stop that. And largely, we didn't make strong restrictions. So we've made an implicit choice. Of course, the annual flu is nothing in comparison with the pandemic. But the point is that there's a point at which we make these trade-offs. And right now, we're making decisions about when these restrictions should be relaxed to reflect this trade-off, right? Different jurisdictions are already making different and difficult decisions about this, different provinces, different parts of the world right now, about relaxing these restrictions. And in general, these decisions should at least be well informed in terms of what the costs and benefits are. It may be hard to compare these things, but an attempt, we think, should be made. And one of the observations that's important here as well is that the kind of analysis of these impacts is very regional. I mean, different parts of Canada are facing different issues. There are a lot of similarities, but the different costs and benefits across different jurisdictions is quite significant. There's also a medium-term perspective that we want to emphasize here as well, and this has sort of been made before, and that's the question of whether costly restrictions that are imposed now are likely to pay off later. So in the decision of whether to relax restrictions, should we be deciding to push the restrictions a bit further into February, let's say, in a hope that we'll avoid a future resurgence of Omicron, or maybe the spawn of Omicron, whatever it's called, might be avoided. So these kinds of issues are important in the medium term, and there's been some suggestive evidence in the past. In particular, there was work done looking at the flu pandemic across U.S. cities that suggested that cities that did well after the flu pandemic are often ones that imposed a stronger restrictions. Of course, there's some debate about this, but it's the question is still there. So, and we argue this is still a crucial question today, and it's going to depend on what happens at the sectoral level, as well as other things, the rate of recovery of each industry and each sector, the interconnections that we see along the supply chain, and the seasonal nature of economic activity, which also plays an important role, largely interacting with the seasonal nature of the virus itself. So there's a medium-term perspective to this. And then finally, another important set of reasons for thinking about what the economic costs are just thinking about a long-term perspective, anticipating the next wave or the next pandemic even. So, the question we're asking, of course, is, how much should be invested in preventative measures, critical health infrastructure, and the skills needed to deal with future pandemics. These are costly things, and at some level, we have to compare these investment costs in the health system and the education system to what the expected costs of future restrictions that are necessitated by this lack of investment. I guess that what I'm alluding to in particular is the capacity of hospitals in the face of this pandemic has been a major restriction throughout the world. And it's also always a question of how much we need to invest in expanding that capacity, depending on the likelihood of future pandemics. So these are all, I'm just trying to motivate the goal here of estimating these costs or achieving some sense of how these costs depend on different factors. So our objective in the last few months, or the last few years, I guess, has been to think about these problems. And what we've developed in the framework that we're looking at has been the kind of a descriptive model to try to quantify the impacts of COVID-19 and do it in a way that is useful for policymakers making decisions in real time. And that's kind of the objective here. And so there's lots of challenges in this. And I kind of like this quote from a paper that was written in 2020, well, first published, not published, but as a working paper in 2020 by Hawaii and Fahy. And that is this one. So COVID-19 is an unusual macroeconomic shock. It's a messy combination of disaggregate supply and demand shocks. These shocks propagate through supply chains to create different cyclical conditions in different parts of the economy. Some sectors are tight, constrained by supply constraints, and struggling to keep up with the demand, while other sectors are slack and shedding workers to reduce excess capacity because of lack of demand. And this is the kind of features of the impacts of COVID that we want to capture in the framework that we're developing here and understand the implications of, and at the end of the day, quantify the costs of. So, of course, there are many challenges to this. And this, just to be clear here, this is a kind of introductory seminar on all this. That's what we've intended here. So we're not going to get into a lot of the details of the actual models here. This is a relatively high-level kind of discussion here. And I think in future seminars, we'll be looking into more of the details. But of course, the features that we want to capture here are these multi-sectoral impacts. And of course, in the economy, one sector being hit by a shock not only affects employment and output in that sector, but also the demand that it has for inputs from other sectors, the supply of inputs that it provides to yet other sectors, to user sectors. There's a whole chain of events that affects employment and GDP and income and people's incomes in general. And of course, there's also impacts happening through household income. People's employment prospects are impacted. They may have they may then change their consumption patterns, and that's going to lead to yet more effects. So we kind of know all this is happening, but of course, capturing it and quantifying it in a single framework is non-trivial. It's difficult to do, and doing it at a provincial level, which is what we're particularly interested in here, because a lot of the decisions regarding health and these restrictions are made at this level. Another aspect to this, which is obviously related, is the dynamics of that process. So, there's a long history of discussing input-output frameworks, for example, in economics, that refer to the intermediate production of goods and services and the supply to different sectors and how that evolves. But then they're often very kind of static models. And one of the features of what we wanted to get at were the month-to-month supply chains that are a kind of a dynamic process. So the intermediate goods and services may be provided in one month and affect things, or the lack of supply may affect things in the following month, for example. And so the whole dynamic there that is related to the buildup of inventories or the decline of inventories of goods and services, which affects production in general as well. So there's a whole process that is fairly complicated. In addition, as the quote that I just mentioned suggested, there's lots of parts to this shock, right? The supply side shocks, there's demand side shocks, and there's a lot of decisions that have to be made in modeling this about how to capture a lot of that stuff. As we said, we're trying to capture kind of high frequency estimates. We're trying to use data that's available at a relatively high frequency because we want to provide information to decision makers that is up to date and can be, affect their decisions going into the next month. This is how these decisions are made. So this is where we'd like to provide that information. And there's a lot of limitations because of that. In addition, when we're talking about kind of high frequency implications, we have to deal with seasonality, right? Because both in terms of the pandemic, but moreover in terms of production. So from month to month, obviously different sectors generally in normal years would have peak years and low peak years. And so we have to take into account those effects that would normally occur even in the absence of pandemics. We mentioned as well the regionalized impacts. We wanted to talk about the provincial level. We have attempted as well to go further and think about more local regions, like economic regions within provinces, which requires additional amounts of data and some modeling and some information that it's pushing things a little bit further, and that's what we've tried to do. And as we'll show in a bit, we've developed the dashboard that's available to smaller regions that might allow them to understand what the impacts are in their regions. In addition, there's a lot of issues about, as I've mentioned, about workforce diversity. There's a lot of the impacts are varying across different groups, and I would like to know more about that as well. That is something which is very difficult to capture in the frameworks we're using, but is obviously connected. And then finally, I've used this term flexibility, but what I mean by this is that in the modeling choices that we're making here, we want to have a framework that can respond quickly to new information and new data, can develop new scenarios going forward. We want to be able to throw lots of different potential scenarios, policy and epidemiological scenarios at this framework. And that means that we have to limit its comprehensiveness in some respects in terms of what we endogenize and what we don't, and what's treated exogenously. And so, we made some choices there, and we'll discuss some of those as we go. So the way we viewed this was when we started thinking about this, although there are a lot of frameworks, a lot of models, a lot of forecasting models, there's a specific issues that are arising in this particular context of the COVID-19 dynamic that we felt were limiting those models, and something new was needed. I've listed some of these here. The length of time over which we're forecasting is quite short. We want to focus on the impacts in particular of restrictions and lockdowns, supply side constraints in particular, and some frameworks focus a lot more on the demand side, for example. Others don't focus enough on the demand side. So we kind of wanted to allow for all these possibilities. We wanted to think about very short-term or medium-term scenarios, and we wanted to be kind of local in this, provincial level at least, or potentially even more regional. And in terms of empirical sort of estimates of GDP, Statistics Canada obviously produces a lot of this, but there tends to be quite a lag. And for example, GDP estimates on a monthly basis are provided with a fairly 2-month lag. It's sort of sped up, I think, in the last little while from 3 to 2. And but it tends to be for the national economy, not with the provincial level. And when we look for provincial GDP estimates, you can't really get it at that kind of frequency. And so this is kind of part of the goals of what we're trying to achieve here. So the framework we've developed is called this studio model, which is the acronym there is actually very descriptive of what the nature of the model is. It's a short-term, under-capacity, dynamic input-output model. And the intention of it is to be a kind of planning tool, as I said, to help quantify economic costs of alternative scenarios related to a bunch of things like labor supply constraints, lockdown policies, and various kinds of demand changes. We want it to be responsive to new data as it becomes available, account for the economic costs of what's happening by both industry and location, try to reflect the dynamic impacts of these various supply constraints, achieve kind of projections that allow for various scenarios. We've kind of thrown a lot of things at it, reflecting uncertainty regarding changing policies, disease, and consumer and firm behavior. And then, as I said, we want to regionalize these impacts. So that's kind of what the basic model is supposed to be about. And that's what we've tried to achieve. So in a very general sense, the main components of this model that we're working with, or the framework in general, is, involves a mapping of the economic connections that, between different sectors and locations through the supply chain. So, it reflects the input-output structure. It tries to reflect the input-output structure of the economy, and also the impacts that incomes of households are going to affect, how that's going to affect consumption, and then taking into account other aspects of demand as well. This is a framework that is fairly well understood in its basics, I think, at least by economists, and it's sort of been the basic idea of that is well sort of founded in many ways. One of the things we're focusing on here, though, as I mentioned, is the dynamic process underlying that, because we're talking about things at a monthly level, monthly frequency, and so we want to think about that, the dynamics over time of production that's going on there, and that we have to make a lot of assumptions about this. We have to make, there's a bit of guesswork involved, some estimates of how these relationships work, but this is a prototype model for doing this. So there's a kind of dynamic production process. Inputs, especially of goods, take time to produce. They take time to be used by the next sector. They're not all sort of used simultaneously, and so there's an evolution over time, and the inventories that different sectors have are going to be affected by this. If there's a shock, inventories would either decumulate or accumulate depending on the nature of the shock. And in addition, we've got a framework for thinking about how different sectors recover from these shocks. Okay, so there's a process by which that happens. It's just as soon as the shocks are the constraints, for example, are removed, as soon as lockdown constraints are removed, for example, the economy doesn't just jump right back to where it was, because there's a process that takes time. Okay, and that's going to be part of the model, and that's kind of a feature which is different from a lot of, frameworks traditionally used. Although there are frameworks that have this process as well. And then we wanted the model to be able to update every month as soon as we get data in. We're using a lot of data from the labor force survey, for example, that is input and used to update our estimates all the time, because we're not predicting the future. We're just using what we know and then considering different future scenarios at every point in time. Okay, and we don't want to claim we're predicting the future in any way, because especially in this context, where every month something new comes up. So this is an attempt to quantify different possible scenarios going forward. So again, as I say, I'm not going to get into the details of the model, but I'm going to just describe what it consists of. Essentially, as I said, it's this dynamic model that's really designed to assess the impacts of supply constraints. So a lot of traditional IO models are more about demand impacts, but this framework has both. And there's actually a class of models that has been designed to look at the impacts of various kinds of natural disasters. And this framework is related to those. The core of the model is related to a model developed by Avellino and Hewings in 2019. But it's representative of a class of different types of models. We're combining that with information data from provincial input-output tables, which is available from Statistics Canada. And actually, I should point that out is, this is something that actually Canada has that a lot of countries, including the US, doesn't really have anymore. They used to, and that is a publicly available provincial input-output tables. So in the States, in the US, the states don't really have this anymore. There are various companies that can kind of develop estimates, but there's no public use kind of framework for that. And so this is something that's unique to Canada in some respects. And we need also data on consumption expenditure shares and demand components and all the things that affect households' levels of consumption. And as I said, employment and hours data and wage data is coming from labor force survey, at least on a monthly basis. Going back in time, we can use sort of longer term surveys as well, but the monthly updates, which is the kind of the only data we have really that's available to update is the labor force survey. And then we're also, because we want to look at the impacts of different policies relative to some counterfactual. And the counterfactual we've focused on a lot is what would have happened, what was expected to have happened in different sectors of the economy in the event that COVID hadn't happened. So these are forecasts that were made before the impact of COVID began, to try and understand what the impacts are of COVID, right? So that's kind of the counterfactual. Of course, as we move forward, we're having to change this a little bit, but the initial estimates we have are based on estimates from the Conference Board of Canada. And we also, to look at sort of more detailed lower level regions and subgroups of employment, subgroup employment shares in particular, we've used estimates from the census in 2016. So of course, this is lagging data, but these are the best sort of estimates that we had. And then of course, an important aspect of all this, and even though it's listed at the bottom, it's not the least important, it's as important as anything else, are just epidemiological and forecasts and assessments that are provided by other people. And as we'll describe, we're not building in the epidemiology events. We're not trying to predict them ourselves. We're having have a hard time doing the economics, let alone the epidemiology. There are models out there that sort of combine these things, but at this sort of practical policy-oriented point, where there's so many complications and changes in how to interpret the data that it's really hard to think about exactly how you would do this very easily anyway. And so this is something we're not doing. So we're basically taking this is a decision we've made to take these forecasts and assessments and basically use them to develop these scenarios. So the bottom line is we're using the framework to compare the costs of different scenarios, right? So we're taking various kinds of epidemiological and policy scenarios that are being discussed by epidemiologists and policymakers, and asking, well, what would happen if this was the case? What would happen if this was the case? Basically, we're translating those into time paths for supply constraints and demand changes over time. So basically, looking backwards, we have the actual data in most cases, not every case. But going forward, we're basically trying to develop these scenarios. And so we're using the studio model to trace out the impacts that has on the economy in the different sectors. And it's just estimating the economics of COVID under each of these potential scenarios by location and industry. So that's the basic idea. So I think that's conceptually straightforward. The costs we're measuring in two main terms. There are other ways we could do it as well, but we're focusing in particular on full-time employment, which is basically hours used in production. And also the cost, an important part of it, are the cost in terms of GDP. So one of the things that comes out of the input-output model, of course, is an estimate of GDP impacts. And just to remind people, because the word GDP is often used liberally without really defining it, at the end of the day, what really matters about it from our point of view is its income, right? It's people's income. 63% of GDP is labor income. 26% is the operating surplus, which is profits, returns to capital and rent. And then 11% of it are taxes net of subsidies, the net of it going to the government of different levels. So, you know, I say this because sometimes the reaction to thinking about production is that, well, you know, it's not as it's something that is kind of abstract. Well, these are people's incomes. These lost incomes, even if they were replaced by the government spending, for example, through wage subsidies and unemployment benefits, they're costing someone somewhere along the line. We know that the debt has risen, obviously, astronomically, and this income at some point is going to have to be, this loss of income, sorry, is going to have to be paid for. So the model is going to, you know, generate estimates by industry. You know, this is just one graph that you could generate from it, obviously. The industries in the IO, there are actually 32 industries in the IO model, but we've aggregated them here to 16 industries that are associated with the labor force survey. So that's what this graph is showing, but I mean, this is just an illustration. And then we have a kind of dashboard that looks at the impacts by economic region, at the provincial level, but also at sub-regions. So one region is Eastern Ontario, for example, that's given here. And so we have, you know, geographic region, we have like different alternative scenarios one could consider, and in each, and the different time frames. And in each case, we're trying to, you know, provide information to decision makers, this is the idea of it, on what the impacts on employment and GDP in particular are, hours, etc. And so we can think about the impacts going backward in time, but also under different scenarios going forward in time. So that's kind of a very high-level summary of the basic idea of the framework, and we'll talk a little bit at the end about some of its limitations and future research. But for now, I'm going to switch over to Frédéric, who's going to tell you a little bit more about some of the implications.
Thanks, Hugh. Thanks for passing it on here. We're sort of moving into two sections. One is, the first is the some of the findings of the model. Some of them have been published in the research that Hugh listed at the beginning, a paper in the Canadian Journal of Economics. And then the second part of my presentation there are on our current work on the Omicron variant and the recent policies that have been adopted by provincial governments and what the impact has been on labor. We have some preliminary data from January that we've been using into this model. So if you want to move on to the next slide, Hugh. So this number here, COVID has been very costly for the economy. I think the message here, these are numbers from the paper in the Canadian Journal of Economics. So we're seeing 165 billion in cumulative GDP loss from March to December 2020. These were very, focused on 2020. Some of our initial research findings, and converting this into jobs, 1.4 million annualized job loss over that same period. The idea, I think, here is that the model provides a good framework, a good mechanism for computing the GDP loss in real time. Real time is really one of the points that he was talking about. With that labor force survey, this real-time data, we can get some insights into what's actually going on in the economy and get numbers in terms of GDP and then the impact on job when we annualize over time. In terms of jobs, 1.4 million, it's hard to wrap our head around what that number means, but really it's about if we had 1.4 million jobs over 1 year lost. Of course, we have larger spikes, but if we spread them out over 1 year, it's 1.4 million full-time equivalent jobs that have been lost. And so those numbers would line up with the numbers we're seeing from StatsCan that are now publishing the GDP estimate and so forth. But of course, those numbers were being produced in real time as the labor force survey was released in 2020. We're going to see those numbers again now with the Omicron variant a little bit later in the presentation. Next slide, here. The heterogeneous impact, and this goes to some of the information that Hugh is presenting. We have data from all provinces. We have IO tables that are very specific to each province. And so we can capture all of those heterogeneous impacts across sectors in province. So across sectors, we get data from the labor force survey that is disaggregated across 16 labor force industries. When we apply this on, it's both by sector and by province, of course. And then when we apply those to our model, we simulate each of those provinces, each of those sectors. And we get, as you can see from this is sectoral contribution to GDP. The next slide is to hours, the same result there. But we can see how it's a lot of numbers. I guess my point was is to show, let's just compare, let's go back. Let's just compare Canada here. Go back to the table here. Yeah, so we can see the numbers across Canada, and we can see how each sector is affected. We can see the heterogeneous impact is that not all sectors are affected in the same way, and some are affected more on the GDP side, and some are affected more on the hour side, because the wage is not equal across those sectors. And so finance and some of those sectors are heavily affected when you look at it nationwide, but really on the hours side, some other sectors are affected more heavily. For example, accommodation, food services there is very high, but since wages are lower, we get the impact is not as impressive compared to finance on the economy as a whole. All the numbers differ across provinces because we're using, again, the labor force survey that provides us information by province and the IO tables. And so we really capture each of those differences in each province. The next slide is on imposing restrictions earlier, which often imply lower economic costs overall. I think that was a very important finding of our analysis. And it's because of those relationship between supply chains, rehiring labor. And so as you impose lockdown restrictions, when you reopen, you still have lagging effects of those restrictions. So we published some findings early on, I think in early 2021, when we were finishing the second wave and looking at a potential third wave, and looking at, is it, from an economic point of view, is it better to have one longer lockdown or two shorter lockdowns? From a second and third wave, we obviously know the outcome of what happened from a policy perspective. Maybe the third wave could have been avoided with a longer lockdown, maybe not. And I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not making any statement about what could have happened or not. But the point of our model is to take in the information from the health people doing the modeling from public health and bringing this to the data to tell a story on the economic side. And from those numbers, we can see that one longer lockdown was much cheaper. The foregone GDP was lower with one longer lockdown than with two shorter lockdown. And we're going to see this story appear again when I talk about Omicron a little bit later on. And why is that? It's because, as the slide says here, it takes time when you lift restriction to rehire staff, but also each lockdown creates some shortages in the supply chain that also take time to clear. If you go back into a second lockdown, you still have those shortages, those sort of compound, and you get a much bigger impact on GDP overall. I know we're a bit with time, so I'll go into future scenarios right away because we want to have some time for questions. Some of the future scenarios, we are working actively on, of course, trying to get some insights from the Omicron outbreak that began in December. And the next slide here, we have some estimates of what this could mean in terms of foregone GDP. Those are the predicted cumulative GDP loss, predicted job loss, again, in units of GDP and full-time equivalents. This is over 2022, but it's assuming one scenario because we don't know what's going to happen, of course, from now until December 2022. We may all go back to normal, or we may have a wave after wave after wave. That's of course, we're going to find out. But this right now is using the January LFS data, bringing this into the model and seeing what has happened with the policies that have been implemented in December across all the provinces. We have different, of course, impact across each province, across each sector. putting this to the data and saying, in this case, this is I would call it the optimistic scenario. It's everything goes back to normal after the recovery from this Omicron shock. And what we see is loss of GDP of about $20 billion and about 170,000 full-time equivalent job loss. This is annualized. So of course, in January, we're seeing a much, much larger number of jobs lost. But then once it's spread out, this continues in February and March as we recover. There's still some knock-on effects. But when you spread this out over the full year, we get 170,000 jobs. Next slide. Right, so now the first scenario here, relaxed restrictions, as I said, a back to normal scenario. This would be the blue line, and you don't really see it here in the beginning because it's underneath the yellow line as well as the green line in the beginning. So we start in December 2021, Omicron becomes headline news. There are no restrictions imposed yet because the LFS, the labor force survey that was done, it was in the second week of December, I believe. So it precedes any of the policies that were implemented in December. So we have 0, that's our benchmark. Whatever the situation was in December is our benchmark. So assume that's our new normal. Now we have a shock. And if we look in January, the second point there, that's the shock imposed by the data. You'll see that all 3 scenarios are the same. Relaxed restrictions, return of Omicron, and maintain restrictions are the same because that's based on the data. And then those begin diverging in February as we assume different paths. Relaxed restrictions seems to be in line with what the provinces have decided to announce in the last few weeks. Basically, we're slowly relaxing restrictions towards the end of January and the beginning of February towards a full reopening. You'll notice some knock-on effects, even though we assume that those are not maintained in February. There's still further losses in GDP, and those are knock-on effects. All of the shocks in January have an impact on the supply chain and other industries to those relationship in the input-output table. Starting in February, we have a nice recovery, and everything goes back to normal, assuming best-case scenario, I would say, in the optimistic recovery. That's the 19.7 billion that I showed just on the previous slide here. Now, we can consider 2 alternative scenarios, one of which would be we begin reopening and it was too early and we have to impose restrictions again. That would be the return of Omicron here in yellow. Or the alternative scenario is we do not reopen and we maintain restrictions for longer. This would be maintain restrictions. In our scenario here, we assume for an extra month. And so 1 more month of restriction until we begin reopening. Why do we consider those 2 scenarios? Well, it's an interesting trade-off. And again, I'm not a health modeler, so I don't know what are the probabilities of each of these happening. But hopefully, those who are actually looking at the disease and the transmission of the disease can put some probabilities in some ways on what could happen if we reopen, or if we impose more restrictions, or if we maintain restrictions for an extra month. And so the trade-off is between reopening earlier or remaining locked down. And so we see that, as we said earlier, 2 waves is more costly with the same result here, right? So return of Omicron, 45.5 billion in foregone GDP is more costly than 30.9 billion in maintained restrictions. So 2 1-month lockdowns that are about 4 months apart is worse for the economy than 1 2-month of restrictions. Now, one of the issue, of course, is that when policymakers are taking that decision, they may not, it's not a sure thing that reopening will lead to a second wave. And so there may be a weight on relaxed restrictions, back to normal, everything goes back to normal with a second wave, right? And so when we reopen, maybe there's 50% probability of back to normal and 50% probability of a second wave against locking down, then for sure I'm getting this extra cost. And that probability is going to tell you which of the 2 scenarios is actually cheaper ex ante. That's not the role of our model to provide that probability. Right now, those numbers that I put on the screen there, I did the calculation. So 43% probability of a second wave or second wave of restrictions would be the cutoff point at which it would be, if it's more than 43%, then we should maintain restriction. If it's less than 43%, then reopening would be less costly. And again, those are scenarios. They're not meant to be exact numbers. They're just meant to inform policymakers so that they can have an idea, and working with, as Hugh said, working hand in hand with those doing the modeling on the health side can let us provide better scenarios that match and that are consistent with the projection on the health side. Next slide. Yeah, so I think there's 2 slides. I'm out of time. I know we've taken questions. So impact by sector. I'll go through this quickly. These are the same 3 scenarios as we've seen on the last slide. Same colors, relax restrictions, return of Omicron, and maintain restrictions. Not much to say here, but we can see that this is all pretty consistent. But generally, the impact, again, by sector is quite heterogeneous, because some sectors like accommodation and food services are much more heavily impacted. But all sectors are affected because there's those knock-on effects. And so when one sector is affected, less demand for other sectors, and so forth. Last slide, very quickly. This is thinking ahead. What if there is a transition to an endemic phase? And that's a lot of health professionals, public health policy experts talk about eventually transition to the endemic phase. And I'm not saying it's going to happen after the Omicron, but eventually, hopefully, it's going to happen. What is the endemic policy? And we're simulating 2 scenarios here. The blue one is back to normal with no restrictions and no supply shock. But we have a case where it's endemic, and at all times there is 1% of the population that has COVID or cannot work because of COVID. In the winter, maybe we get some surges. Maybe we have 5% of the population that cannot work. And so we get those supply shocks. And we can compare this against a scenario where there is sick leave, and those who have symptoms, maybe there's testing and so forth, rapid test, must isolate, and that reduces the spread of COVID. In that case, maybe at all times, there's 1.5% of the population that cannot work because they have symptoms, they must isolate, but this reduces the surges. And so those surges are 3% instead of 5%. This is all illustrative. I'm not claiming that these numbers mean anything. I'm not doing health modeling here. I'm just doing economic modeling. And so we're comparing this, and what we're showing here is that we're saving, there's revenues for the GDP foregone is lower by 1.2 billion by providing sick leave. But again, this is extremely dependent on those percentage. But working hand in hand with health modelers, we can maybe inform those percentages and get some insights into whether this policy not only helps the health sector, but can also help on the economic side, because you reduce your peaks, your surges, which has a lower impact on your supply shock when those surges occur. Just an illustrative example. Maybe, but the numbers are not necessarily the correct numbers. It's again, what does it mean from a policy perspective? So I think that's it for our future scenarios. Here, yet one last slide. We'll take questions after that.
Okay, thank you, Frédéric. So yeah, just to finish off here, I'm just going to mention a little bit about future research that we're sort of thinking about now. Of course, this is a model, right? And it's got a lot of limitations, and it's designed for a particular purpose. There are lots of things that we have assumed that partly made assumptions because we didn't know what else to assume, or we were had limited information. So some examples include, the production functions that we're using in the model. This is a very short-run model where we're thinking about the economy being under capacity. So we have like constant productivity within each sector. So output per hour is kind of a fixed number. Of course, that's not necessarily a great assumption, especially if we think about seasonal effects as well. So we're working on, we try to deal with seasonality in other ways, but but we have to think about that a little bit. But of course, thinking about the details of particular sectors is going to allow us to learn a lot more about that. It's not something we've built in yet, but I think that would be useful. This is a short run model. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of aspects that are just held fixed. So, or at least treated exogenously. So this is not an equilibrium model. There's no endogenous price wage adjustment. You could build some of those things in, but there's the intention here is to model a situation where markets weren't particularly working that well, and exactly how prices and wages adjust in the short run. Eventually, prices and wages during the pandemic, they've risen, but it took a long time. So there's a question of how that happens. We don't have the answers to that. So this model basically treats those things exogenously. We allow those things to change over time, but not as part of the model. Things like the technology is fixed. There's limited input substitutability. Actually, at the level of aggregation we're looking at the sectors, that's not such a bad assumption, but it's a limiting assumption. And we have, we can imagine lots of situations where the labor supply, and I think this has arisen as well, is moving around between different sectors, different regions. We're not endogenizing that. Again, we can treat it exogenously, but not endogenously yet. Another aspect of this that's where we could potentially improve. We actually have thought through this a little bit more and thought about how to add this, but and that's the sort of endogenous feedback between economic activity, epidemiology, and policy. So here we're basically taking the epidemiology and policy decisions as given and translating them into what the economic impacts would be. Of course, there are impacts of the economic activity that we're treating on the epidemiology that we're telling stories about, but we're not modeling at all. And part of and again, that was a decision that was made explicitly. We actually did try to develop versions of the model that had that in, but it becomes very difficult because, the nature of the epidemiology seems to be a very complex sort of moving target. The case data itself is, the interpretation of it changes all the time, especially recently when we've basically stopped measuring a lot of the cases. And so it's kind of hard to decide exactly how to build that in. So as I said, the scenarios we've used are based on recent forecasts and policy responses. And then the other kind of assumption we're making here is we're treating each province as a kind of small open economy. That's probably a strong assumption. And although there are interactions through trade, we're basically treating them as small open economies. So that has implications as well. And there's room for improvement there. This is not an exhaustive list, but we're just pointing out that there are lots of ways in which one could improve on these kinds of estimates. And so we think of this as a work in progress in that sense. So that's where I'll stop. Hopefully that's about the right timing, and see if Ellen has anything to say.
Thanks so much, Hugh. Sadly, I think we're out of time, so I don't think we'll be able to get to some of the questions that we had, but we have captured them. I was just writing a message to everyone, letting them know that we captured them, and we can follow up with you afterwards, and feel free to reach out to us. I know Rosalie put in the chat a webpage that you can go to if you want to partner with us. I'll also throw my email, and maybe Hugh and Frédéric can do the same. So you can follow up with them directly. It sounds like there's a lot of people working in similar areas or having similar findings that I think some collaboration would be fantastic. So I just want to thank you guys again and remind everyone that in 2 weeks' time, I'll be having another seminar with Beck out of U of A on the environment. So a very different topic, and hopefully we can learn more about other sectoral impacts of the pandemic. Thank you.